Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to work with observable and promise. These are two of the way of doing asynchronous programming, and we briefly mentioned them before, but now let's look at example. So for understanding the difference between observable and promise, I will give an analogy. Say if you go to Amazon.com and if you order something, they will immediately send you an email saying that your order has been placed and this is the tracking ID. So you have not received your item yet, but you got a order ID or a tracking ID that is giving you the confidence that you will receive something in the future. So consider that to be a promise, as the name suggests that you will receive something in the future. But since you ordered once, you will receive it only once. So that's how promise works. Whereas if you go to a newspaper website and then subscribes for that newspaper, then what the newspaper company will do is they will keep sending you copies of newspaper, and then each copy of the newspaper can have different things. So that's how observable works. So the analogy for observable is newspaper subscription, where you might receive multiple things in the future, versus the analogy for promise is an online order similar to Amazon, where you will receive a one-time thing in the future. So with that, let's see some example. So in our user service, we already have a observable, which is this user variable. Now if we want to work on this observable, what we need to do is we need to subscribe. So let's write that example. So this dot user dot subscribe, that's a method. Now what this method expect is we need to tell what will happen when this subscription is successful. So when this subscription is successful, that means a user is actually returned of type Firebase user. So the syntax for that is we need to give a variable for what it's going to return. So that can be anything. We can call it user info, and then the type for this will be the same type as this one, Firebase user. And when this happens, actually in this case we probably don't need the type, so let's ignore the type, and we need to provide a arrow function, which is we're telling that when this user info is available, do the next thing. So what is this next thing? Here we need to describe what to do with this user info. So for now, let's just go ahead and let's print this user info. So we can do console.log user info is available, and then here if we pass this user info, this will get printed. Let's save this and let's see this in action. So if you refresh, you will see that user info is available and it is actually printing that object. And if we expand on this, you will see that there is no display name for this, but the email that we used to sign up, that email is available there. So that's how we work with Observable. Luckily, within this user info, there is also something present that will allow us to demonstrate the example of promise, which is if we call user info dot get id token, you will see that this id token will return a promise of a string. You can see here when I am hovering over it, giving that this id token will give a value called promise of a string that will come in the future. So let's see how we can work with that. So now we're going to write a function for print id token, and this id token needs it will get a id token as a promise. So let's declare that here, id token, and once it gets that, so this is of type promise, so we can actually like specify that type here like this, promise of string. And you can see how I came up with this is because we are going to pass this id token here, and if you go over here, it is actually telling that the type is promise of a string. So we are just using that here. So now once we have that, now let's see how do we work with promise. So for working with promise, what we need to say is id token dot then. So when the way for observable we used subscribe, for promise we are using then, and here we need to describe what happens then. So when that value is available, so we need to just name a variable here similar to the subscribe example. Let's call this here, call this id token value, id token value, and when that is available, what do we do? For now, let's just go ahead and do print it, console.log and we can pass here id token value, and we can print that value here. Actually the variable name is id token value, so we need to say here id token value. So now we need to call this method. So for calling this method, we can just remove this console.log and we can pass it, call this method. Or let's take a look at the example of when this observable is working and we want to do multiple things. We can basically use this syntax of these curly braces, and we can do those multiple things inside that. So one thing is we're doing console log user info is available, and in that case we're printing the user info. The other thing we are doing is this dot print id token, and we are passing their user info dot get ID token. We are passing that promise there. So we are doing these two things. Save. So when this user observable is satisfied, we are subscribing to that. We are saying that when this observable returns some user info, print that user info with user info is available, and then also call this method print ID token and pass the user info dot get ID token, which is a promise of a string, to this method. And in this print ID token method, since we received a promise of a string, we are writing that promise dot then, and when it's available, we are calling this ID token value and we are printing that console.log ID token value. Now let's see it in action. So we can refresh it, and since we are logged in, you'll see that user info is available, and here we are showing the user info, and next we are printing this ID token value. This ID token value will be useful for us to securely communicate with our backend Java service. Thank you.